Good morning. It's a pleasure to be in Krakow. Pleasure to be at my first confidence. Something I might have for this talk. Anyway, we almost had a light go down. So yes, my name is Joseph Slowik. I am not a hacker. I'm a dedicated defender. I'm a blue teamer. I got my start in U.S. government. I was a naval officer doing various cyber sorts of missions, and then I was at the Los Alamos National Laboratory running the incident response team for a while. But as part of that work, one of the things that always drove my passion was the idea of threat intelligence. And while that's something that I do, and while I'm still a dedicated defender, now I'm doing this more or less on my own terms in the private sector in the US for a industrial control system focused security company called Dragos. So I've been there for a little over 2 years now, focusing on the ICS landscape, but still taking that very threat intelligence focused approach to what it is that I do. Now, you might think about this like, well, threat intelligence, where is this coming from for you? And well, my background as a naval officer certainly has the cyber aspect, but the community that I was in included intelligence operations. So usually when people hear that I have a passion for cyber threat intelligence, they assume that I was an intelligence officer. However, I was not. My opinion of intelligence officers is varying depending upon the intelligence person, because you have various stereotypical ways of looking at what these sorts of people do, from what the public thinks that we do, to what some people might want to think that they do, to what they really do, which is making lots of PowerPoints. But irrespective of that, my field, while I did lots of cyber sorts of things, was really dedicated towards technical intelligence. So signals intelligence, analyzing radar, and then cyber was just one part of the things that I did. And a lot of the motivating goal behind that job was to provide the people in the ship or in the aircraft or whatever with near real-time data about threats that they were facing, which is something that I've brought with me into the more traditional network defense field now, and something that I think has a significance for how we conduct cyber threat intelligence from a pure blue team perspective in the current environment. So what are we going to talk about? First, we're going to talk about what's the purpose of intelligence, because if we don't get clear on what it is that we're doing, I don't think it makes sense to talk about this. So lay the groundwork for some common definitions. Then we'll talk about what threat intelligence means from an operational standpoint before moving on to this concept of indications and warnings, that real-time threat intelligence aspect, and then provide some examples and applications to illustrate what we've talked about and provide some ways of taking this back to your organization. So first, what is intelligence? So back when I was a student, I'm older than I look, the gentleman by the name of Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense for the United States, and he had this quote that many people made fun of because it sounds pompous, ponderous, etc., that there are three kinds of knowledge. There are the things that you know, which, okay, we know the things we know, that's fine. There are the things that we don't know about, but we know that we don't know them. They're known unknowns. And then there's the things that we don't even know that we don't know. So that sounds kind of silly, but when you think about it a little bit, it applies to what we do from a network defense standpoint. So we know what we know. I know the hashes for the latest version of Sophos or Winty or Emotet or something. I know what I don't know. I don't know the latest variant maybe, but I have a reasonable understanding for how this malware works or what its command and control looks like. But then there's the things that I don't even know I don't know. What the adversary might do next, what they might change to for operational purposes, and that I really don't even need to just find out, but I need to figure out how to figure out I don't even know that in the first place. So it seems circular in a fashion, but it's an important way of understanding what the goal is of what we're trying to do. And furthermore, when we start talking about intelligence, it's not a one-size-fits-all application. Instead, intelligence really depends on who your audience is. So this is an image illustrating from a military perspective sort of the concepts in question, that really things run the gamut from big picture strategic perspective all the way to the tactical day-to-day operation standpoint. And what's important to realize with this image is that your product, your message, the information that's most relevant varies depending on your audience. And if you're not modifying what it is that you're saying and how you're presenting it to who it is that you're presenting, you're probably going to result in a message that's not going to be received very well or even understood all particularly well. And when we talk about intelligence too, there are three primary things that it requires to be useful. So first off, it has to be accurate. If your intelligence is not accurate, then what are you even doing? Just roll things up. We don't care anymore. But it also has to be timely. It's one thing to say, and this gets into the concept that we'll be talking about in greater detail today, I can provide you with great information about something that happened 10 years ago. What does that do for you now? It informs you on something that happened previously, but it doesn't necessarily help you with what's going on right now. And lastly, it must be relevant. So if you are defending a bank, or if you are defending a software development company that has a lot of intellectual property, and I give you lots of information about hacking elections, that's interesting. Is it really relevant, though? Maybe some of the TTPs behind it might be for how things initially started off, but how groups hacked Facebook or whatever, created lots of social media profiles, it doesn't matter. So it's not relevant. So ensuring that we have these concepts in mind makes the product we produce from an intelligence standpoint useful. But that use, like I implied earlier, is going to depend on who your audience is. So at the very highest level, talking to your C-suite, your CIO, your CISO, the board of directors, or your boss perhaps, or whatever, you have this big picture strategic level, like what's going on, what is it that the Chinese maybe are trying to steal in terms of intellectual property based upon current planning by their government. Okay, that's useful potentially from a big picture planning perspective, but your SOC doesn't care about that. At a mid-level, like, okay, well, what are the sorts of things going on a day-to-day, on a not necessarily day-to-day basis, but over time that I need to invest in order to make sure that I'm meeting what's going on in the environment. So your SOC managers, your incident response managers, the people who are setting budgets, deciding what tools to acquire. What sort of landscape do I face that's going to inform the decisions I make that are going to impact operations for the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months? And finally, at your tactical level, what's going on right now? What phishing campaign is going on right at this moment, or do I anticipate in the next week? How does it behave, and what do I need to do to detect it, respond to it, and then remediate it? So a very immediate sort of level detection and analysis. And that's really what we're going to focus on mostly for this conversation. It doesn't mean that these don't matter. It just means that your strategic and operational audiences are much smaller, generally speaking, even though they're very important. And really, this talk is meant to inform the immediate defender to make him or her do their operations better to respond to threats. Now, when we start talking about the intelligence as a process, really we look at this as a sequence of events. That we begin with an operational environment, move on to the collection of data, distill that into information, and then from that produce some sort of deliverable. But oftentimes when we look at what's provided from commercial threat intelligence, that the things that we emphasize are the data aspect and then the intelligence aspect. What's missing? Well, we talked about, your phase one, gather a bunch of data, something mysterious happens, and then phase 3, I have a threat intelligence report, either a private report that you paid much money for, or a public report that's part marketing, part threat intelligence, or whatever. But what happens in the middle is kind of missing. And so you're left with this sort of bifurcation, this division between what happens very immediately, data, and then what happens after quite a period of time, generating intelligence and ignoring what's in the middle. Hence the talk, meet me in the middle. But anyway, so if we look at this, threat intelligence reports, many of us are familiar with these sorts of ideas. They're finished reports, or it's a narrative that describes an event, a campaign, a piece of malware maybe. That's a separate topic, whether or not that's actually intelligence. We can talk about that at the bar maybe later. But lots of detailed information in here that requires a lot of time, effort, and analysis to get from that data perspective to a finished intelligence report. Thus, it's not going to be something that you get immediately after or while something is occurring, but often weeks, usually months, potentially even years after something happens. So it's after an event has taken place, you're backward looking. You're always sort of backward looking because these are always responses to things that have happened, but in the case of a finished intelligence report, you're significantly backward looking because you can only produce this after a period of significant analysis and production. So examples of this range from the sort of foundational aspects of our field, the Mandiant APT-1 report, the initial big bang of commercial threat intelligence reporting, to really good malware analysis reporting like Symantec's Stuxnet dossier, things that are controversial like Kaspersky's Slingshot report, especially if you were in the US, it was a good report though, to things that are just really bad, the Norse growing cyber threat from Iran report. That is the report to look at if you want an example of what not to do in a threat intelligence report, and they're out of business, so I don't have to worry about them yelling at me. But anyway, so that's good. We have examples of that. But what about something that defenders deal with on a daily basis? Indicators of compromise. You always hear people like, I need the IOCs. I need the IOC to do something or whatever. It's like, well, do you? Well, we'll see. IOCs ideally are contextual, but usually IOCs, as we receive them to act upon, are atomic in nature. It's a single data point, an IP address, a hash value, a domain. They're nice in that it's a speedy, quick way to transfer information, to communicate it to other parties, but they're lacking in the sense that it's, on the one stance, they could be highly variable in terms of their quality. Are you getting good IOCs or are you getting bad IOCs? Am I getting the hash value for PSExec or for the hash value for Mimikatz? Well, what does that really tell you? Because it's trivially easy to change the hash value of Mimikatz. The source code is on GitHub. I can do whatever the hell I want with it. Thus, the hash is meaningless. So it's a lot of questions for what actual value I'm getting out of them, even if I can transmit them and receive them quite quickly. So for example, the indicator of compromise as it initially developed was not a single data point, but multiple data points clustered together. So when I see this set of hash values along with this registry key or whatever, I know that I have an indicator of this specific type of compromise. There's a lot to be said for that idea. It's not perfect, but it gives you some idea of, if A and B or C, then alert. There's some contextuality built around that. The problem is that when we talk about indicators of compromise, what we get are these. This is the Grizzly Step report that the US CERT released in response to Russian meddling in US elections. And it had a lot of IOCs. Like if you're just strictly judging by quantity, this is a good report. But if you're judging by quality, it leaves a lot to be desired because, yes, I have values, and even though they had the presence of mind to say, comment, explain what this was, none of these are actually filled in. So I don't know what any of these are for. Is that a command and control address? Was it a domain used to deliver a file? Is it a domain that was a compromised legitimate address? Therefore, maybe I shouldn't block it, but I should alert on it. So this seems like it's good, but I refer to this kind of as information security junk food. You can devour lots of it very quickly and easily, but it doesn't nourish you at all. It doesn't really do much for you. And then as we start getting to these atomic, not very contextual examples of an indicator, then we want to start talking about ingesting them and using them at machine speed. So this is just one example. There's plenty of commercial examples of this as well, of a US-centered initiative on trying to get organizations to share IOCs rapidly so that they could put them into their defenses right away. Well, that sounds good, except if you want to do something like block Google or block Microsoft or blacklist PSExec, which your admins might be using or something along those lines, this is how you do it, because you're just ingesting information without analyzing it, which can lead to very bad things, like your users can no longer get to Gmail, or your users can no longer resolve DNS, depending upon how your environment is laid out. So it can be very bad. So from a coverage perspective, IOCs allow us to get quick alerting and response. It's beneficial in the sense that I can do something fast, but I lose the ability to add context or any sort of additional information around it. While intelligence reports can be very thorough, the Win32 Stuxnet report is hundreds of 120-ish pages long. It's very interesting and very detailed and very in-depth, but as a result of that, though, it takes months to put that sort of analysis together, if not longer. So if I'm talking about an incident that's happening right now in real time, it doesn't do a whole lot for me in order to help respond to that. So what we're missing is here. So we've talked about raw data, those IOCs. We've talked about the very fancy intelligence reports. But what about just minimally enriched data? Things that we've taken the raw feed from and added just some minimal bit of context around so that while we're getting something fairly quickly, we've also managed to add a little bit of extra information around it so that we understand, one, what it might be, 2, we verified that it's actually bad. And 3, made sure that it might be relevant to the audience that we're talking about. So, in supporting operations, intelligence doesn't exist in a vacuum. If intelligence existed on its own, then I don't know. Although if you look at the news, Recorded Future was just acquired for like $750 million US. So evidently we're doing something right. But for intelligence to be functional or useful or valuable, it has to support actual defense operations. But in order to do that, raw indicators, as we see with IOC reports, aren't good enough because it's going to make us make mistakes. It's going to let us feel like we're doing something even though we're not doing much at all. And the finalized reports are good, but they're not timely. So what we really need to do is enriched information that provides indications of hostile activity and warning of malicious behavior that can be informative and time sensitive. So getting back to that concept of intelligence needs to be relevant, accurate, but also timely in order for it to be operationally relevant. So my background on this, I hinted at this at the very beginning of the presentation. So I was what was then called an information warfare officer. They're now called cryptologic officers because as a community, the community I was in is very confused about what to call ourselves. But the idea, though, is that you get sailors sitting at consoles in darkened rooms on a ship or whatever that are just trying to figure out, like, okay, I can see, for example, that I have a radar track or I have something that's picked up on a sensor somewhere. And based upon that data point, I can correlate it with another data point, what frequency that radar is operating on, or some aspect of the communication that's been intercepted from that particular unit, and then correlate that with a set of information to figure out what it is. So I can differentiate not just that we have a contact somewhere out there in the world, but I have a contact whose radar happens to map onto this type of aircraft, which, given the order of battle for where we're operating, correlates to this platform for this country that doesn't like us very much. Therefore, you should care about this. I haven't figured out what its intentions might be. I haven't figured out what the broader strategic scope might be. That's for the intelligence analyst to do months later. But I've informed the people that I'm directly supporting that, hey, there's something that you should probably care about that's out there. Here it is, and based upon what correlating information, here's what you might want to do about it. So you don't have the complete picture, but it's a lot more than just saying there's a dot out in the middle of the ocean somewhere and we don't know what it is. It gives people who are operating tactically enough information to start making informed decisions about for self-defense. Well, this is a concept that sounds pretty useful from a network defense concept as well. So to reference another American with Polish heritage, Richard Bejtlik, and disclosure, I work with his wife, Amy, who is also a very brilliant intelligence analyst. You know, he defined sort of a concept of indications and warning from a network security monitoring standpoint in his book, The Tao of Network Security. And what's important to emphasize about this, if you could read quickly, but the main thing is really understanding that the indications and warning part is dialed into or focused on hostile behavior, what its indications are, and warning of what may be to come. So it's very threat-focused, very much attack-focused, as opposed to either informative, educational, like you might see in an intelligence reporting, or very atomic and unenriched, like you see with an IOC. We're trying to add on not just that something is happening, but context around it so that we know, from a defensive standpoint, what we could do about it. So what INW avoids, attribution. Attribution is a touchy subject because, you never want to say like, oh, the Russians or the Americans did this or whatever, because then we'll prove it. How do you know this or whatever? Like, that's an entirely separate line of conversation. Takes a lot of work, a lot of analysis, which means it takes a lot of time. So we want to avoid that for this case, but also we want to avoid adversary intent. So from an indications and warning perspective, I don't care necessarily beyond the strict functionality of a piece of malware, what it's for. I don't need to care if the French are trying to steal nuclear secrets or trying to gather political military intelligence or whatever from a strategic perspective. I just need to know that I see Animal Farm in my network and here's what the characteristics of this bit of malware. Those are all topics for backward looking, let's understand what the incident involved and I can write a report on it later. But for in the moment defense, that doesn't matter. It doesn't help your SOC to respond to what's happening. What instead we need to focus on is differentiate and categorize threats. Does this malware spread? Is it is it a initial access tool? Is it a some other sort of tooling or whatever, and how do I respond to it? What are the characteristics of this network traffic? Is this IP address or domain adversary controlled, or is it adversary compromised, and what does that mean for me? And thus inform defenders to enable their response. Do I block it? Do I let this go so I can capture some traffic to see what's going on before I respond? How do I remediate this malware? Do I need to just delete the file, wipe the machine, or do I need to take the motherboard out, throw it in a wood chipper, and never use that device again because it had some BIOS-based, in firmware rootkit or some other exotic thing in mind? How do I deal with the threat in question? But in saying this, it's important that I get some grief from traditional intelligence analysts. It's like, you're saying my job doesn't matter. It's like, no, your job does matter. And in fact, these positions, these roles, work together fundamentally if you look at this as a cyclical process, is that cyber threat intelligence tracks the overall threat landscape. What APT28's malware looks like, what equation group's malware and C2 functionality looks like, and then informs INW by providing the data that indications and warning uses to enrich individual observables. So that from a day-to-day operations standpoint, your in-the-field tactical threat intelligence operation is taking what's observed and matching that against what is known about the environment to produce an enriched set of indications and warnings about observed behavior in the environment. But what's important is that that just doesn't sit in isolation, and not just isolation in the sense that I inform the SOC so that they can respond. I also need to inform my bigger picture CTI analysts that, hey, this is what we've observed, so that they can begin to modify their picture, their bigger picture of the overall adversary environment, which then feeds back into the context and background that I use on a day-to-day operational level to categorize, inform, and enrich the things that I observe in my environment. So really, while I've talked about only one particular and unfortunately rather ignored piece of the threat intelligence picture, your traditional threat intelligence reporting still has quite a big role to play as long as the sides are cooperating. Because ideally, what we want is cyber threat intelligence provides this big picture overview, this in-depth analysis of what the adversary is, what they do, who they might be, and then combines that with the security operations team who provides that day-to-day defense of the network to result in a near real-time, very much operationally focused threat intelligence indications and warning that enables active, realistic defense within the environment. So to illustrate this a little bit, I'm going to talk about two examples, both of which I worked on in my own shop for Dragos, but have a lot of other public commentary on them. So Crash Override and Destroyer, the 2016 Ukraine Power event, and then the Shamoon 3 event and its potential relationship to APT33, which I think is also Helix Kitten. I might be wrong on that. I don't know CrowdStrike's names as well. But anyway, Crash Override and Destroyer. So January 2016, lights went out in Ukraine for the second year in a row. Lots of media reporting, and then Black Hat talks, blogs, etc. That is Robert Lepofsky from EFSET. I presented on stage with him at Black Hat USA about this back in July of 2017, August of 2017, whenever that was. So it sounds like an event that we knew a lot about. We had lots of reporting and newspapers, etc. But if we look at how this event played out, did we really do a good job? So the event itself happened in December of 2016. At the time, there were suspicions that, oh, did this happen again? Because we had the 2015 Power event. But there was no information sharing. No one really knew what happened until, until in January, you started getting sources, news articles from like Reuters and from other services that Ukraine was convinced that this was a cyber attack, but still no information for why they knew that, at least none public. So I can say from a private perspective, since I was still in US government at the time, that we were kind of confused what was going on within weeks and months of that event as well. Like, well, we think this might be happening, but we're not really sure. So if you were another electric utility in Ukraine or in Poland, close to Ukraine, or in the United States, you didn't know what was going on and how to defend yourself against a similar sort of attack, if this even was a cyber attack. It wasn't until in June of 2017, late June at that ESET and Dragos published in-depth reporting on the malware of what the Crash Override and Destroyer framework did, how it manipulated electric distribution operations. So it was really good from an ICS malware standpoint, but again, if I was a network defender responsible for defending an electric utility, yeah, I know what to see when Crash Override gets in the environment, the very last stage of the attack, but I have no idea what led up to making that attack possible. So from a defensive standpoint, I'm still disadvantaged. It wasn't until October of 2018 that, at least publicly, among other things, I published a white paper, which can be viewed online or whatever, and gave some presentations about the attack lifecycle in question, how the attack was actually facilitated, how initial access into the industrial control environment was achieved, what the adversary did to move around, all those necessary steps you would need from a defender's standpoint to stop something like crash override or in-destroyer from affecting your operations in the first place. So if we look at this from a raw data sharing standpoint, we were almost a complete failure. There were hashes available in June of 2017, but that was 7 months after the attack took place. Hashes are trivially easy to change and are very brittle or very easy to adjust or whatever. And so from a defensive standpoint, you're not leaving people with much to respond to. And thus, there wasn't really any information to allow for that whole of kill chain, whole of attack perspective until almost 2 years after the attack took place for defenders to act on. From an indications and warning perspective, we might have eventually had a success in that we were able to inform operators and asset owners of how this attack cycle took place, but it wasn't until a long time after the event itself actually happened. So anyone who is seeing crash override-like precursors before October of 2018 was kind of left at the mercy of the adversary without having that information. From an intelligence perspective, if we look at intelligence trying to provide a backward-looking overview of the event in its entirety, we didn't do a bad job. The initial reporting on some of the initial aspects of the malware was okay. Once we got a fuller picture of what was going on and access to more data, enriched that a little bit more, so that was good. But like we said earlier, from the perspective of an actual electric utility defender, it doesn't make a difference at that point because we could have had the same adversary operating in other environments and insufficient information was available to let them know what to look for a similar attack. Okay, so I fell on my sword for that one because I think myself, Dragos, we could have done a better job. Not going to speak for anyone else or whatever, but just things that we need to think about. Another example, a little bit more recently. So in December of 2018, we had the third round of the Shamoon wiper attack taking place in Saudi Arabia. A little different in that the entities that were attacked were foreign-owned entities operating within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as opposed to Saudi entities themselves, but again, those are finer details we can speak about over beers later. The main thing is that this was covered all over the place. Shamoon itself hadn't really changed all that much, so everyone jumped on this immediately, like, we saw Shamoon again. But what was interesting about this is that a few weeks after the initial reporting of Shamoon happened again, McAfee came out with some public reporting that linked what was observed to a advanced persistent threat labeled APT-33 by FireEye. We call them the Magnalium at Dragos because we all have to have our own names. Another topic. But linked APT-33 activity in the year or longer prior to the Shamoon event as being the precursor to deploying the wiper framework. Oh, that's very interesting. From a defender standpoint, I would have wanted to know that or know some indications of that might take place because then I could react appropriately to seeing APT-33 activity. And then shortly after that, FireEye publicly released a report that confirmed more or less what was reported by a McAfee or McAfee's, okay. Projectors going up and down, sorry. But that sort of confirmed McAfee's reporting that, yes, we saw this or whatever, they gave it a name, overruled, or that APT-33 operations did seem to be precursors to deploying Shamoon within victim networks. Oh, that's really cool. Except at this point, you already have networks that were wiped. What good does that do you? So, and I had a caveat to this actually. So I do not know what FireEye's private reporting was. So if you're a FireEye eyesight subscriber, you may have been fine. This is a public reporting item, and there's the argument well, you only get what you pay for, and if it's free, good luck to you. But anyway, from the standpoint of did we do a good job? I mean, maybe we did. So reporting was fairly good in coming out almost in real time in reaction to events, which is good, but we're talking about a wiper here, and one that spread fairly widely within victim networks. So it's one thing that, hey, a day later after I got hit by another version of Distrack Wiper, this is what happened. Well, my network's already wiped. You haven't helped me at all. You just gave me a reason why my network is wiped. So that might be less than helpful. But again, the caveat, I don't know what the private eyesight reporting may have been. So maybe for FireEye customers, this was very valuable because they were getting an indication of, hey, we see this entity getting into networks. Not 100% sure what they're doing, but here's what's happening so you can be prepared for whatever may come next. But what we could have done better really depends on the accuracy of that APT33 attribution. Because from a public reporting standpoint, at least, and some private reporting that I'm familiar with, while this entity had been tracked somewhat, they hadn't been tracked very well. That, oh, we know they're active, we can say that their tactics are trashy and they're very noisy and easy to follow, we won't pay attention to them that much. And then they end up deploying a wiper, well, okay, that's pretty bad. So what we needed to do is really provide better indications of what this entity was up to within networks so that victims in question could have responded to those potential intrusions well in advance of this adversary being in place to deploy a wiper widespread in victim networks, resulting in significant dislocation. So let's wrap this up. I think I have a little bit more time. Where are we right now? So really what we need to do is INW bridges a critical gap between raw data, which can lead us down wrong paths because we don't have enough information behind it yet, and finalized threat intelligence reporting, which perhaps waits too long before we're able to do anything valuable with the information in question. Security operations benefit from this because now your SOC, while they're not getting data instantaneously, that's not called good threat intelligence, that's called magic. But what they are getting is in fairly real time information about what it is that they're seeing to better respond to events as they take place. And as a result of that, they can do their jobs better. They can identify like, oh, I see weird communication coming out of the network. Like, oh, I understand maps onto registration patterns similar to what Fancy Bear is known to use. So this is more than just a weird network connection. This is potentially very bad C2, and I should act accordingly. But the thing is that, and I say this as someone who works within the cyber threat intelligence industry, is that as an industry and even as dedicated shops within companies, we don't do a very good job of actually putting this into practice. Everyone wants to emphasize the sharing of the IOCs, and everyone wants to hang their hat on writing the very fancy 10, 20, 100-page report. I don't know why. No one reads the 100-page report, but you get it. So the thing is that in order for INW to become a concept that does end up helping the SOC, enabling better defense, is that CTI has to buy in that this is something that we need to do. Whether that means embedding analysts within the work center or some other action, that we really need to start embracing the idea of bridging that gap between just collecting the raw data and then writing up something lengthy about it weeks or months later. So what can you do? This is kind of like the most important slide. Like, oh, that was very nice, Joe. Thank you for telling me. What do I actually do about this? Well, among other things, from an analyst perspective, we need to lose some measure of pride that instead of just like, oh, let the machine-generated IOCs go out, we don't care about those. I want to write the big report and make a name for myself and give a black hat talk or a recon talk or something along those lines. Like, no, your defenders really need you to do this sort of work. So it's not just a question of getting your, rolling one's sleeves up and diving into the data to do that correlation in near real time, but also being more open to, yeah, I don't know the complete picture yet, but here's what I know right now. This might change a little bit, but based upon what I've gathered and what we already know, here's something for you, my SOC Tier 2 defender, can take action for within what we're seeing in the environment right now. Sharing groups also can buy into this a little bit as well. So I don't know who here is part of like an ISAC, or you start talking about the national level certs. Many of these organizations are organized just like private sector CTI providers, where you have lists of IOCs, sometimes shared semi-automatically, and then overview reports and nothing in the middle. Sharing groups need to open themselves up to better communication and find mechanisms to share not just those two types of information, but events as they're happening to the benefit of defenders, because otherwise you're putting people at a disadvantage relative to attackers that have much quicker development cycles than we do, unfortunately, and we get behind the curve. Finally, from a vendor perspective, we as vendors need to get comfortable with reporting before the whole story. So this is something at Dragos that I've put together, is that yes, we will release reporting within 24 hours or so of observing something, knowing that we don't have the full picture and letting our customers know that, hey, this might change, it might not be accurate right now, but here is things as we see them at this moment. More players can do this. This is something that I did in the Navy when it came to things like tracking radar signatures, for example. It allows defenders to at least get part of the picture to begin taking some informed response, even if they don't know necessarily where everything is going. And then, along those lines, tailor products to different customer needs. Too many times it seems that threat intelligence products are really geared towards one audience, the strategic audience. This is what the Chinese are doing with relation to intellectual property theft across these 5 industries. That's really fascinating to read, but if I'm the watch person or the incident responder or the security operations center person, I don't care about that so much because it doesn't impact my day-to-day operations that much. So as customers, we can put pressure on vendors to say, hey, this report is very interesting, but it's interesting for not the people who are actually responding to events on a day-to-day basis. Can you help me out by providing something a little bit more? And last thing I forgot too, for what we can do as analysts, one of the things that I did when I was running an incident response team and not doing dedicated threat intelligence operations is I didn't care about the IOCs unless I could take that IOC and either pull the malware myself from VirusTotal or pull the domain from a Risk IQ or something else along those lines and actually analyze it myself, because I realized that I wasn't getting the detailed information necessary to actually take action on it. What the malware does, how it behaves, how it ties into other campaigns. The hash didn't tell me that. So as consumers, for the time being, until everyone else catches up, that's kind of what we need to do ourselves, because no one's helping us out or supporting us with that sort of work for us. So what we're ultimately looking to do is, again, trying to find something that's timely, that we're getting information in sufficient time to inform and enable our operations personnel to take defensive actions. That's descriptive, that just doesn't say that this hash is bad, this IP address is bad, but no, this IP address is being used for a encoded form of C2 associated with this threat actor that behaves in this way. That told me enough in a sentence or two for me to take a very informed response to what it is that I'm observing in the environment. And lastly, it needs to be actionable. So just because I observe something, what does that mean? Being able to tie that back to a certain type of adversary, a certain type of method of behavior means that I can then begin anticipating what defensive responses are necessary in order to counteract that adversary. So that's all that I have. I have some time for questions. I think the podium, I actually am not sure what timing we're on right now, if we have time for questions or not. 5 minutes for questions. If not, or if you'd rather speak offline, I will be around the conference, and you can certainly hit me up through various means. But we had a question. Hi.
Is it okay without the mic?
I'll repeat the question for the audience, too. I think it does to a certain extent, depending upon industry. I think the financial sector has probably done the best amount of work. I know I'm not as familiar. I know some of the UK organizations, and I'm fairly familiar with North American operations, has done a reasonably good job in coming together to do some of what I talked about in terms of not just sharing, but trying to share valuable information. And I think the important lesson from that is that none of that was required. Instead, the financial institutions took a look at the environment like, oh my God, we're losing money and no one's helping us. We have to do something about this. In other sectors, especially when you start talking about sectors that deal with a question of both proprietary and reputational issues about being breached, whereas everyone assumes the banks are always going to get breached or someone's always going to try and breach the banks. You start talking about technology companies or utility companies that no one wants to know that they got breached because that sounds really bad, that it's probably going to take someone forcing to a certain extent to make that happen, unless organizations can be more comfortable with real understanding the need and then doing so voluntarily and then being willing to open up to each other to show what's going on. So I hope that helped. Okay. There was another question in the back, I thought. I saw a hand earlier. Yeah.
Hey, Joe. Marcin from FireEye Advanced Practices. You mentioned in one of your first slides that from indications and warnings perspective, the capabilities of malware shouldn't be relevant to the incident response team. Mm-hmm. But would you agree with me that when you're responding to a wiper malware destructive piece of code, it actually matters, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah, so in that case, I either misspoke or there was a misunderstanding. So the distinction I'm drawing is the intention versus capabilities, if that makes sense. So yes, if I know that this piece of malware either is or is the prerequisite to or linked to an adversary that does a wiper or crypto mining or something else or whatever, that's important. That tells me what something does. What's less important is why it does it. Was what I was trying to get at. So thank you for asking that question.
Makes sense,
If others had that
Thank you.
confusion, because yes, the why, yes, looking back, I care. But in the immediate sense of responding to it, whether it's Mandiant is going out or advanced practices is looking at something in real time, like we'll figure that out later. But the capability aspect is most important because that's going to tell me both what I need to do right now and what I need to expect later from the defense. So
Makes perfect sense. Thanks.
okay, yeah, thank you for asking that. Okay, I think that's all. I will be around. Thank you everyone for sitting through this and for dealing with, inviting me to speak in English in Poland. So because your English is a lot better than my Polish. So thank you very much, everyone. And